Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling, we're looking at the later life of Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France to use William Shakespeare's description, and one of the women who fought the Wars of the Roses. It's a story of a decade-long fight to regain the throne, of a life on the run, often reliant on the charity of others, and of hard-won successes and terrible tragedies. Ultimately, it's the tale of how and why a person who I think deserves to be known as a warrior queen of England is more often remembered as the woman who lost the Wars of the Roses, and what happened to her after everything and everyone she'd fought for were gone. This video is part of a series on the women of the Wars of the Roses. Please make sure you're subscribed with notifications switched on so you don't miss the other entries or indeed any of my other videos. While you're doing that, it would be great if you could give this video a like as well and follow me over on Instagram. There's a link for that, along with links for books and TV shows about Margaret's life and the Wars of the Roses more generally, in the description box below. When we left her last week, it was March 1461, and Margaret's husband, the mentally unstable Henry VI, had just been ousted from the throne by the new king, Edward IV. The couple and their son, Prince Edward of Wales, also known as Edward of Westminster, fled into Scotland, and the road ahead now looked very bleak for this exiled royal family. In Scotland they all remained for a year, living first at Linlithgow Palace, then the Dominican convent in Edinburgh. They still had supporters amongst the English nobility, among them the Duke of Somerset, whose father had been one of Henry's favourites, and Jasper Tudor, who was Henry's half-brother. Other sometime allies, including Margaret and Henry's uncle, Charles VII of France, were lost though, as Charles died in the summer of 1461. In April 1462, the Queen and her son left Henry behind and sailed to Brittany, where they met with its Duke, Francis II. They then travelled on to meet with her father, René of Anjou, and the Seneschal of Normandy, Pierre de Brassé. Finally, they met the new King of France, Louis XI, at Chinon in June. Margaret needed Louis's financial and military help if she ever wanted to take back the throne for her husband, and she used one of the only bargaining chips she had at her disposal to try to secure it, the town of Calais. Though located in France, the town was in the hands of the English, and after the huge territorial losses suffered during Henry VI's reign, it was the only outpost England had left in that country. In exchange for 20,000 livres, Margaret agreed that when the town was retaken from the forces of Edward IV, it would be given to Louis if she and Henry were unable to repay the loan within a year of that date. At that point, Louis would then need to give the couple an additional 40,000 livres. This was all very optimistic, as it relied on Calais being retaken in the first place, and the plan would be exceptionally unpopular in England, but it got Margaret the money she needed. Just a few days later, on the 28th of June 1462, a 100-year truce was announced between the French and the Lancastrian royals. The Lancastrians, by the way, are Margaret, Henry and their supporters, while the Yorks are Edward IV and his family. For a full explanation as to the background of these two factions of the Plantagenet family, see my previous video on Margaret's life, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you. Margaret now prepared to invade England with her 800 French-bought troops and 42 ships, though Louis was already proving to be an unreliable ally, and this force had to be paid for by Pierre de Brassé. Due to adverse weather, it was October by the time they set off. They went first to Scotland, where she reunited with her husband, then entered England near the end of that month. They took 3 English castles, including Bamborough, but Edward IV sent his cousin, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, to deal with them. They fled by boat, only to hit a storm, lose their ship, and be forced to take the medieval equivalent of a lifeboat, which got them to Berwick Castle, just south of the Scottish border, but then in Scottish hands. It was back to Scotland after this. Bamborough Castle was retaken by the Lancastrians in March 1463, but after the 11-year-old King James III led a failed invasion of England that July, Margaret opted to return to France with her son a few weeks later. She couldn't have known it at the time, but they would never see her husband, Henry VI, again. After 2 failed attempts to take England, Louis was even less disposed to help Margaret further. He agreed a 1-year truce with Edward IV in October 1463 and stipulated that he would no longer assist the Lancastrian cause. In December, the Scots also made a truce with the Yorks, by which they too refused to continue supporting his rivals for the throne. Henry had to leave Scotland, where he was then staying, and moved back to Bamborough Castle. Margaret, meanwhile, set up a little exiled court in the castle of Ker in the Duchy of Bar, which was owned by her father, who gave her an annuity of 6,000 crowns to live off. This sounds like a lot, but it was hardly enough to run her household on, and Margaret was, by royal standards, now very poor. From Ker, she spent the next 4 years, with Henry's approval and consent, attempting to rally supporters to their cause, but with little success. Back in England, the Lancastrian attempts to retake the throne were going just as badly. The Yorks won the battles of Hedgeley Moor on the 25th of April 1464 and Hexham a few weeks later on the 15th of May. After Hexham, the Duke of Somerset and other leading Lancastrian loyalists were also executed. All remaining Lancastrian strongholds in the area fell to Edward IV, and a ragtag little band of exiles then went to Margaret, who had to feed them as well as her pre-existing household. To add insult to injury, Edward IV announced his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in the autumn of 1464, meaning Margaret's place as Queen of England had now been taken by another woman. Then, in July 1465, came another disaster. Henry VI, who had been on the run since the defeat at Hexham, was captured at Ribblesdale and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His half-brother, Jasper Tudor, was still trying to help as well and was on good terms with Louis XI, who provided him with troops to try to retake the crown for Henry in the summer of 1468. Though Jasper did manage to take Denbigh Castle in Wales, his success didn't last long. He was chased out and back to France in August by the forces of William Herbert, the man to whom Edward IV had given what had been Jasper's earldom of Pembroke, as well as custody of Jasper's nephew, Henry Tudor. More on that when I do videos on Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, though if you see my video on the life of Henry VII Part 1, that will also tell you about this future king's dangerous childhood. It must have seemed as though all was lost and the Yorks were unassailable. But as happens so often in the Wars of the Roses, the pendulum of fortune did gradually swing back in the opposite direction towards the Lancastrians. In the summer of 1468, Edward IV married his sister Margaret of York to the Duke of Burgundy, angering Louis XI, who now decided that perhaps he would continue to support Margaret of Anjou's cause after all, despite Jasper's failed invasion. Edward had also lost the support of his brother, George Duke of Clarence, and their cousin, the Earl of Warwick, thanks to his secret marriage to a lowly Lancastrian widow rather than a rich and well-connected European princess, his pro-Burgundian foreign policy, and his refusal to allow George to marry Warwick's daughter, Isabel Neville. The Duke and the Earl then took Isabel to Calais and married her to George in September 1469 without Edward's permission. Next they went back to England and succeeded in beating the king at the Battle of Edgecote Moor on the 26th of July, briefly imprisoning Edward in Warwick Castle, then Middleham Castle, and attempting to rule in his place with the king no more than a puppet. This failed, Edward secured his freedom, and despite some attempts to heal the breach, Warwick and George tried to oust him once more in March 1470 in order to replace him with his brother. They failed again and had to flee back to France. For more on these events, see my videos on the life of Edward and George's mother, Cecily Neville, linked below for you. George and Warwick first approached Louis XI for assistance, and on the 25th of June 1470, Queen Margaret and her son arrived at Amboise, where they met with Louis themselves. He was very keen to promote an alliance between the Lancastrians and the Warwick-George duo. Margaret took quite some convincing, though. We have a letter written on the 29th of June by Ambassador Sforza de Bettini of Florence to his master, the Duke of Milan, in which he says that Louis has spent and still spends every day in long discussions with that queen to induce her to make the alliance with Warwick and to let the prince, her son, go with the earl to the enterprise of England. Up to the present, the queen has shown herself very hard and difficult, and although His Majesty offers her many assurances, it seems that on no account whatever will she agree to send her son with Warwick, as she mistrusts him. Her reticence is understandable. Warwick was Margaret's long-standing enemy. the man who she blamed for all her troubles, perhaps just as much as she blamed Edward IV, and someone who had spread rumours that she was an adulteress and that her son was illegitimate. As for George, he was the brother of the man who had usurped and imprisoned Margaret's husband. Eventually, though, she was talked round. De Bettini wrote to the Duke of Milan again on the 24th of July, this time from Angers, that the Queen of England and the Prince of Wales, her son, arrived here the day before yesterday, and on the same day the Earl of Warwick also arrived. The same evening the king presented him to the Queen. With great reverence, Warwick went on his knees and asked her pardon for the injuries and wrongs done to her in the past. She graciously forgave him, and he afterwards did homage and fealty there, swearing to be a faithful and loyal subject of the king, queen, and prince as his liege lords unto death. To seal the deal, Warwick's younger daughter, Anne Neville, was betrothed to Prince Edward in Angers Cathedral before the month was out. The stage was now set for another epic showdown in the Wars of the Roses. On the 9th of September 1470, Warwick set sail for England with 60 French ships, leaving his daughter in France. Prince Edward did not accompany him, but Jasper Tudor did. After so many years of setbacks for the Lancastrians, finally they were victorious. Edward IV was in the north and not in a position to defend his capital, and London fell to the Lancastrians with ease. Henry VI was freed from captivity and restored to his throne in October, an event known as the readeption. Edward IV was forced to flee to the Low Countries under the control of the Duke of Burgundy, and his pregnant queen, Elizabeth Woodville, had to go into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey with her children. The marriage between Prince Edward and Anne Neville now went ahead in December in Amboise. It was finally time for Margaret, her son, and her new daughter-in-law to return to England. There was a problem, though. Louis XI refused to let them go until Warwick declared war on the Duke of Burgundy, which had been part of their negotiations prior to Warwick's departure. When he got his wish, though, Duke Charles, who was married to Edward IV's sister, Margaret of York, remember, was suddenly much more disposed to help his exiled brother-in-law regain the throne. So it was that Edward managed to regroup and return to England with Burgundian support in March 1471. His brother Clarence now reassessed his options yet again, and having calculated that he was never going to get the throne if the Lancastrians continued to hold it, he defected back to his brother in early April, bringing him further troop reinforcements. Clarence, by the way, came to a very unpleasant end in 1478, which I have a video on if you're interested. I'll leave it linked on screen and below for you. Edward and his forces entered London unopposed on the 11th of April. Queen Elizabeth and her children came out of sanctuary, and Henry VI was reimprisoned in the Tower of London. As for Queen Margaret and the Prince and Princess of Wales, thanks to further delays caused by bad weather, it was the 14th of April 1471 by the time they landed at Weymouth, and when they did, they received terrible news. That very same day, Edward and Warwick's forces had clashed at the Battle of Barnet in Hertfordshire, and Warwick had been killed. It was a serious blow, and combined with events in London, it meant that Edward IV had the upper hand again. The end of all Margaret's dreams and struggles was now very near. She, Prince Edward, Anne Neville and their followers headed for Wales to join forces with Jasper Tudor, but they never made it. Edward IV was hot on their heels, and he caught up with them at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May. Margaret, Anne, and some other noblewomen took shelter in a nearby religious house, though we don't know which one, while her son went to fight for the throne. The 17-year-old Prince of Wales lost. He was killed that day by Edward IV's forces, and when his mother and wife were found in their sanctuary, they were taken prisoner by the Yorks. Margaret was carted back to London as a trophy, and on the very night she arrived, the 21st of May, her husband died in the Tower of London, very possibly murdered on the York King's orders. It was all over. The family and throne Margaret had fought so hard for since her marriage in 1445 and the birth of her son in 1453 were gone. She now had no husband, no child, no position, and no importance in England. She'd lost the Wars of the Roses. Though we don't know her exact reaction, I think overwhelming grief, particularly for the loss of her son, who very unusually for the time had actually spent most of his short life with his mother, is the most likely. Compared to the drama of her married life, her remaining years were much quieter. She stayed in England for several years as a prisoner of Edward IV, though for much of that time she was actually in the household of Alice, Duchess of Suffolk. Finally, in 1475, Edward agreed to ransom her back to Louis XI for 50,000 crowns. She was returned to France in January 1476, having been made to renounce all claims to any titles or possessions in England, such as her dower lands and belongings as queen, which would have provided her with a high income. Louis also forced her to renounce all claims to her father and mother's lands in France. She lived first in the Château of Reculay, then the Château of Dampierre in Anjou, and was supported by a pension of 6,000 crowns from Louis. Again, not really enough to run her household on. Margaret of Anjou, former and arguably dowager Queen of England, died impoverished and mostly forgotten in Dampierre on the 25th of August 1482 at the age of 52. As per her request, she was buried with her parents in St. Maurice Cathedral in Angers. When we look at Margaret's life as a whole, I find it hard not to feel a great deal of pity and admiration for someone whose story wouldn't be out of place in a Greek tragedy. She was dealt an incredibly difficult hand when she was married off to Henry at the age of just 15. She was a French woman in a country where that wasn't a popular nationality to be, and saddled with a husband who was ill-equipped to be king, had severe mental health problems, and with whom she struggled to have a much-needed heir. There were constant threats to their position, most notably from Richard, Duke of York, then his son Edward IV, and Margaret had to fight for her own and her immediate family's position in a way that few English royals, and even fewer royal women, have ever had to. History, as they say, is written by the winners, though, and had Margaret's son survived Tewkesbury and taken the throne, I think she would be venerated and esteemed for her struggles in the way that her sister-in-law, Lady Margaret Beaufort, often is. Not that Margaret Beaufort wasn't also a very strong woman who deserves our admiration too. Instead, as she was on the losing side, her reputation was maligned for centuries, not least by William Shakespeare with his She-Wolf of France description of her in one of his plays, which certainly wasn't meant as a compliment. It's hard to know how she could have done much better with the options available to her though, and in modern times her actions and reputation have been reassessed much more favourably. Hopefully now her strength, intelligence and fighting spirit are more readily recognised. Let me know in the comments below what your opinion of her is, and if you enjoyed learning about her, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. If you fancy learning more about the Plantagenets and the Wars of the Roses, try one of these videos next. Whatever you select, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.